The Mafia Boss burned her wedding invitation, but the groom's name made him go silent. Why would a single name change everything in an instant? What could make someone who seemed so certain suddenly fall completely silent? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you love emotional, cinematic stories filled with unforgettable twists, heartfelt relationships, and powerful character journeys, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for your incredible support and for being part of this wonderful community. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if one unexpected detail completely changed your perspective, would you follow your first reaction or search for the truth? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let us step into the beginning of this unforgettable story together. The greatest mistakes are never made with fire. They are made with certainty. The cream-colored envelope arrived on a gray Monday morning, resting alone in the center of the polished oak desk inside my private office. Around it, reports from trusted advisors, investment summaries, and invitations from influential families waited for my signature, yet none of them drew my attention the way that single envelope did. There was no company logo, no official seal, only my name written in handwriting I recognized instantly. Claire Bennett. I had not seen her handwriting in almost 2 years, but memory has a strange way of preserving the details the heart refuses to forget. My assistant quietly placed the morning coffee beside me before stepping toward the door. There is another meeting in 30 minutes, Mr. Blake. I nodded without looking away from the envelope. Reschedule it. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. People rarely question my decisions, but everyone inside Blake Holdings understood one thing. If I changed my schedule without explanation, something important had happened. After the door closed, silence settled over the office. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched beneath a cloudy sky while black SUVs waited outside the building's private entrance. Security personnel moved with practiced discipline. Through the lobby below, yet none of that registered in my mind. My attention remained fixed on the envelope. Claire had always preferred handwritten notes. She believed words deserved time. She once laughed when I answered messages with one-line replies. Some things, she told me years ago, should never be rushed. I slowly opened the envelope, unfolding the thick ivory card inside. Elegant gold lettering reflected the morning light. A wedding invitation. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the page without fully understanding what I was reading. Claire was getting married. The realization landed quietly, then all at once. Every unfinished conversation, every postponed dinner, every promise I assumed could wait until tomorrow suddenly returned with uncomfortable clarity. I had always believed Claire would remain somewhere nearby, patient enough to understand that my responsibilities came first. I had never asked whether patience could eventually become goodbye. A sharp knock interrupted my thoughts. My longtime advisor, Victor Reynolds, entered carrying another folder before stopping when he noticed the invitation in my hand. "Everything all right?" he asked carefully. I let out a short laugh that sounded colder than I intended. Apparently life continues even when we are too busy to notice. Victor glanced toward the invitation, but wisely remained silent. He had known Claire almost as long as I had. He also knew better than to offer advice before I requested it. I looked down once more at the elegant card. My chest tightened with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to regret disguised as anger. Before logic had any chance to intervene, I walked toward the marble fireplace burning softly beneath a large landscape painting. Without another thought, I held the invitation above the flames. The edges curled almost immediately as orange light consumed the thick paper. Victor took one step forward. "Adrian." I did not answer. I watched the fire swallow the invitation, convincing myself that destroying the paper would somehow silence everything it represented. Yet as the flames climbed higher, one untouched corner folded open, revealing a single line that had been hidden beneath my hand only moments earlier. My eyes caught the groom's name just before the fire reached it, and every confident thought I had carried into that room disappeared in complete silence. There are names that disappear from your memory with time, and there are names that stop your heart the moment you see them. The burning invitation slipped from the iron grate onto the polished marble floor before the fire could consume it completely. Without thinking, I bent down and picked up the remaining fragment. The edges had turned black, and part of the elegant lettering had vanished beneath the flames, but one line remained perfectly clear. Groom, Michael Bennett. I stared at the name for several long seconds. Bennett. Not a stranger. Not a wealthy rival. Not another influential family trying to make headlines. Bennett. My eyes narrowed as memories I had not visited in years slowly returned. Victor stepped closer, studying my expression instead of the damaged invitation. You know him? He asked quietly. I answered almost automatically. I know that last name. My voice sounded distant, as though someone else had spoken the words. Michael Bennett. Claire Bennett. The same family name. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Anger dissolved into confusion. I looked again, wondering if the smoke had blurred my vision, but the letters remained exactly the same. Victor carefully held out his hand. May I see it? I passed him the partially burned invitation without speaking. He adjusted his glasses and read the remaining text twice before looking back at me. Adrian, are you certain you saw this correctly? I am. He frowned thoughtfully. That changes things. I turned toward the window overlooking the city below. For nearly 2 years, I had convinced myself that distance required no explanation. Claire had gradually stopped calling. I had become consumed by expanding Blake Holdings, managing increasingly complicated negotiations, and carrying responsibilities that seemed impossible to postpone. Every time I thought about reaching out, another urgent meeting appeared. Another international trip demanded attention. Another problem convinced me there would always be tomorrow. Eventually, tomorrow quietly became years. When the invitation arrived, I had assumed she was marrying someone new, someone who had stepped into the place I had carelessly left empty. I had never stopped to wonder whether my assumptions deserved to be questioned. Victor placed the damaged invitation carefully on my desk. Would you like me to investigate? He asked. Normally, I disliked using company resources for personal matters. Today, I answered without hesitation. No rumors. No shortcuts. I want the truth. He nodded once. Understood. After he left, I remained alone inside the office while the last embers faded inside the fireplace. The room suddenly felt unusually quiet despite the steady sounds of the city beyond the glass. My eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph resting on a bookshelf behind my desk. It had been taken during a charity fundraiser almost 5 years earlier. Claire stood beside a group of smiling children holding donated books while I remained several steps behind speaking with local sponsors. I remembered believing business conversations were more important than photographs. Looking at the picture now, I noticed something I had ignored for years. Claire had not been looking toward the camera. She had been looking toward me. My phone vibrated softly across the desk. A message from my security director appeared on the screen reminding me that my evening schedule was ready. For the first time in years, I dismissed every appointment with a single reply. Then I opened my contacts and searched for a number I had never deleted, even after months of silence. Claire. My thumb hovered above the call button, but never pressed it. Some conversations deserved more courage than a phone call could offer. Before I could decide what to do next, Victor returned, carrying a thin folder in his hands. His face looked unusually serious. Adrian, he said quietly, I found something you need to see immediately, and I do not think this wedding is what you believe it is. The truth rarely hides itself. More often, it waits patiently for someone willing to stop believing assumptions. Victor placed the slim folder on my desk before quietly taking a seat across from me. He had worked beside me for nearly 15 years, and during that time I had learned one important lesson. He never interrupted my judgment unless he believed I was about to make a serious mistake. I checked only publicly available records, he began calmly. You asked for facts, not speculation. I nodded. Go on. He opened the folder and slid a single page toward me. At the top was a family registry I had not expected to see. Michael Bennett, age 34. Occupation, pediatric physician. Relationship to Claire Bennett, older brother. I read the page once. Then again. Every line remained exactly the same. Claire was not marrying Michael Bennett. She was inviting her brother to stand beside her as the groom's closest family representative at the ceremony. The invitation had listed family members beneath the names of the wedding party, and because the lower half of the card had been destroyed by the fire, I had seen only one surviving line and convinced myself it told the entire story. I slowly leaned back in my chair, feeling an uncomfortable weight settle over the room. I had not destroyed the invitation because I knew the truth. I had destroyed it because I believed my own assumptions more than I believed Claire. Victor remained silent until I finally spoke. Who was the groom? He turned another page inside the folder. His name is Daniel Foster. I searched my memory immediately. Nothing. No business connection. No political family. No rivalry. Just an ordinary architect from Boston whose career focused on restoring historic buildings throughout New England. The simplicity of the answer somehow unsettled me even more. I had imagined countless explanations over the past hour, yet the real one was so ordinary that it exposed how extraordinary my imagination had become. Victor folded his hands together. There is something else. I looked up. Claire and Daniel became engaged only 6 months ago. I frowned. Only 6 months. Yes. He hesitated briefly before continuing. Before that, she spent nearly 2 years declining every invitation to begin another relationship. His words lingered in the quiet office. I turned my chair toward the windows overlooking Manhattan while memories began returning with uncomfortable clarity. I remembered every time Claire had asked whether I could join her at a charity event, and I had answered that work could not wait. I remembered birthdays celebrated through expensive gifts delivered by assistants instead of shared dinners. I remembered promising we would travel together once business finally slowed down, never realizing business never truly slows down for someone who keeps choosing it above everything else. The painful truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Claire had not suddenly disappeared from my life. I had slowly disappeared from hers. She had simply stopped chasing someone who never seemed to stop walking away. My phone rested silently beside the damaged invitation, both objects somehow reflecting the same mistake. One represented words I had never spoken. The other represented conclusions I had reached without asking a single question. Victor stood to leave before pausing at the doorway. Adrian, may I offer one personal observation? I nodded. You have always been decisive. He offered a thoughtful smile. But this may be the first time your confidence has prevented you from hearing the truth. After he left, I remained alone inside the office, staring at the blackened corner of the invitation still resting beside my hand. The fire had not destroyed the most important part of the message. My pride had. And for the first time in many years, I wondered how many beautiful moments I had quietly lost simply because I had chosen certainty instead of one honest conversation. Regret has a quiet way of changing what your eyes choose to remember. The morning after discovering the truth about the invitation, I canceled every meeting that did not absolutely require my presence. My executive assistant looked genuinely surprised as he rearranged an entire week of appointments, but he asked no questions. Inside Blake Holdings, people had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the highest form of respect. Instead of driving toward another boardroom, I asked my security team to take me somewhere I had not visited in years. The community learning center where Claire had volunteered almost every Saturday morning. When my car stopped outside the modest brick building, children were already laughing on the small playground beside the entrance. The building looked exactly as I remembered, except I realized with quiet embarrassment that my memories came almost entirely from photographs Claire had once shown me. I had promised countless times that I would visit in person someday. Someday had simply never arrived. The program director recognized me immediately and welcomed me with polite warmth. Mr. Blake, it has been a long time. I nodded. Longer than it should have been. She smiled kindly without correcting me. As we walked through bright classrooms filled with books, colorful artwork, and eager young readers, I noticed Claire's influence everywhere. Every shelf carried handwritten recommendation cards. Comfortable reading corners invited children to stay as long as they wished. Teachers greeted every student by name. Nothing inside the building felt expensive, yet everything felt deeply cared for. We eventually stopped in front of a wall covered with photographs from previous community events. My attention settled on one picture after another. Claire helping children choose their first library cards. Claire organizing donation drives. Claire sitting on the floor reading stories while dozens of smiling faces listened with complete attention. Then I noticed something unexpected. In several photographs, I appeared somewhere in the background. At fundraising dinners, charity auctions, community breakfasts. I had attended those events believing I was supporting corporate partnerships. Claire had quietly turned every one of them into opportunities to help other people. She never wanted recognition, the director said gently, following my gaze. Whenever someone thanked her, she always redirected the conversation toward the volunteers. I remained silent. The director continued. There is something you probably never knew. She opened a storage cabinet and carefully removed a worn scrapbook decorated with children's drawings. The students made this several years ago. She turned slowly through the pages until one handwritten note caught my attention. It was Claire's handwriting. If Mr. Blake ever asks why we keep expanding the reading program, please tell him every child deserves someone who believes in their future before they believe in themselves. I stared at the sentence without speaking. The director smiled softly. She always believed you would have understood if you had enough time. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Did she ever complain that I was never here? The director shook her head. Never. She simply smiled and said you were carrying responsibilities that most people could not imagine. I lowered my eyes, unable to escape the uncomfortable truth. Claire had spent years defending me to other people, while I had spent those same years assuming she would always understand without ever asking what she needed from me. Before leaving, I walked once more through the quiet reading room, where afternoon sunlight streamed across rows of open books. Children waved as I passed, unaware that the man returning their smiles had arrived carrying far more regret than confidence. As I reached the entrance, the director handed me a small folded note she had just discovered inside the scrapbook. She asked me to give you this if you ever came looking for answers. I accepted the note carefully, noticing my name written across the front in Claire's familiar handwriting. For a long moment, I simply held it in my hands, suddenly uncertain whether I was finally ready to read the words I should have listened to years ago. Some letters arrive too late to change the past, but exactly in time to change the person reading them. I sat alone inside my car for several minutes before unfolding the note Claire had written years earlier. The paper had softened with age, its edges slightly worn from being carefully preserved inside the scrapbook. Her handwriting remained as calm and graceful as I remembered. Adrian, if you are reading this someday, it probably means you finally found time to visit the place I always hoped you would see. Please do not feel guilty for arriving late. The children will still smile. The books will still matter. Kindness has never cared about perfect timing. I smiled sadly before continuing. I only wish you could see yourself the way they do whenever your donations quietly become another chance for someone else. You have always believed your greatest value comes from protecting people. I simply hoped one day you would realize that being present is another way of protecting them too. I lowered the letter slowly, unable to escape the quiet honesty in every sentence. Claire had never asked for expensive gifts. She had never demanded impossible promises. All she had wanted was my presence. Somehow that simple request had become the one thing I had never learned to give. On the drive back to Blake Holdings, I ignored the stack of unread messages waiting on my phone. My thoughts kept returning to one uncomfortable realization. Throughout the years, I had measured success by completed negotiations, expanding investments, and responsibilities fulfilled. Claire had quietly measured success by the lives improved because someone chose to care. Neither philosophy had been entirely wrong, but one of them had forgotten the people standing closest. Over the following weeks, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone around me. Instead of trying to find Claire immediately, I began correcting the habits that had created the distance between us in the first place. I shortened unnecessary meetings. I stopped answering business calls during family dinners with my older sister. I visited community projects supported by Blake Holdings without advance announcements or media coverage. I listened more carefully during conversations instead of planning my next response before someone else finished speaking. At first, those changes felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Then they gradually became natural. One afternoon, Victor joined me after a meeting with several nonprofit organizations. As we walked through the lobby, he smiled slightly. "You canceled another private investment dinner tonight." I did. That is the fourth one this month. I looked toward the busy streets outside the glass entrance. Some opportunities return if you miss them. Victor nodded thoughtfully. Others do not. I understood exactly what he meant. Later that evening, I stopped by the Community Learning Center carrying several boxes of new books requested by the teachers. There were no photographers waiting outside. No speeches. No publicity. Just volunteers laughing together while children excitedly unpacked colorful stories they could not wait to read. As I helped arrange books across the shelves, one little girl looked up at me with curious eyes. "Are you Miss Claire's friend?" she asked innocently. The question caught me completely unprepared. I hesitated before answering honestly. I hope I still have the chance to become one again. She smiled with the uncomplicated wisdom only children possess. Then you should tell her. I laughed quietly, though my heart felt unexpectedly heavy. If only life were always as simple as she believed. As I prepared to leave, the program director approached me holding a small envelope. Claire stopped by this morning, she said with a gentle smile. She mentioned she would be meeting someone at Riverside Botanical Garden this Saturday afternoon. She paused before handing me the envelope. She did not ask me to tell you. But after everything I have watched over the years, I think some people deserve one honest conversation before life decides the ending for them. The hardest journey is not finding the person you lost. It is becoming someone worthy of standing before them again. Saturday arrived beneath a clear spring sky, and Riverside Botanical Garden looked exactly as Claire had once described it years ago, peaceful enough for people to hear their own thoughts. I parked my car several blocks away and dismissed my security detail before entering through the old iron gates alone. For the first time in many years, I wanted no distance between myself and the consequences of my own choices. Families wandered along winding stone paths lined with blooming tulips and flowering cherry trees. Children laughed beside the quiet pond while musicians performed gentle classical melodies beneath a white gazebo. It was the kind of afternoon Claire had always loved. Simple, beautiful, and untouched by urgency. I found her near the conservatory, kneeling beside a flower bed while helping a little girl carefully replant a young lavender bush that had tipped over in the morning wind. She wore a light blue dress beneath a cream-colored cardigan, and the soft sunlight resting across her hair made the years between us seem both impossibly long and painfully short. I waited until the child ran back toward her parents before walking closer. Claire looked up, and for a brief moment surprise crossed her face before settling into the same calm kindness I remembered. "Hello, Adrian," she said gently. "Hello, Claire." Neither of us moved immediately. There was no dramatic embrace, no raised voices, only two people standing quietly between the lives they once shared and the people they had become. She smiled politely. "It has been a long time." "Far too long," I admitted. She glanced toward a nearby wooden bench. "Would you like to sit?" We walked together in comfortable silence before taking our seats beneath the shade of an old maple tree. The breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers across the garden, while birds sang somewhere high above us. I had rehearsed countless speeches during the previous week, but every carefully prepared sentence suddenly felt unnecessary. Finally, I spoke the only truth that mattered. "I did not come here to change your decision." Claire listened quietly. "I did not come to ask you to cancel your wedding." She remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "I came because I owe you an apology that should have been given years ago." I lowered my eyes briefly before meeting hers again. I believed work could always justify my absence. I believed tomorrow would always give me another chance to be present. Then I received your invitation and realized how many tomorrows I had already wasted. Claire's expression softened, though sadness still lingered behind her gentle smile. "You always carried enormous responsibilities." I slowly shook my head. "Responsibilities explain where I was. They do not excuse where I failed to be." The words remained between us as quietly as the wind moving through the trees. "I also burned your invitation," I confessed. "Not because of you, but because I allowed my pride to speak before my heart had time to think." A faint look of surprise crossed her face before disappearing again. Then I misunderstood what I saw and convinced myself I already knew the truth. Claire let out a slow breath, looking toward the pond where sunlight shimmered across the water. "You always decided quickly," she said softly. "Sometimes too quickly." I nodded without hesitation. "You were right then, and you are right now." For several peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Finally, I reached into my jacket and placed the small folded note she had written years earlier on the bench between us. "Thank you for believing I could become a better man," I said quietly. "I just wish I had believed you before it took losing you to finally begin changing." Claire looked down at the letter, then back at me, and although she did not answer immediately, I saw something in her eyes that had not been there when we first met that afternoon. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was no longer disappointment either. The truth has a remarkable way of changing everything without changing a single word. Claire gently unfolded another ivory invitation from the canvas bag resting beside her on the bench. It looked almost identical to the one I had burned, except this copy remained untouched. She placed it carefully between us and pointed toward the inside page with a quiet smile. This is the version you never had the chance to finish reading. I lowered my eyes and studied every line slowly. At the top, elegant gold lettering announced the wedding of Claire Bennett and Daniel Foster. Beneath the ceremony details appeared the names of family members participating in the celebration. Michael Bennett, brother of the bride. The line I had seen before the fire consumed the invitation suddenly made complete sense. My mistaken certainty had built an entire story from a single surviving sentence. I let out a long, quiet breath. I never even gave myself the chance to understand. Claire nodded gently. You saw one piece and believed it was the whole picture. There was no accusation in her voice, only quiet honesty. I looked at the invitation resting in my hands. I have done that more than once. She smiled sadly. Yes. The breeze turned another page of the invitation before she continued speaking. Do you remember the evening we attended the children's literacy fundraiser 6 years ago? I searched my memory and slowly nodded. You left early because of an emergency meeting. I thought you were disappointed. Claire looked toward the blooming gardens before answering. I was not disappointed that you left. I was disappointed that you never asked how the evening ended. Her words settled heavily between us. She continued with the same calm kindness that had always made honesty feel impossible to argue against. That happened many times, Adrian. It was never one dramatic mistake. It was hundreds of small moments when I hoped you would ask one more question or stay 5 minutes longer. I closed my eyes briefly. She was right. Every memory returning to me now carried the same pattern. I had assumed instead of listening. I had hurried instead of staying. I had answered before understanding. Claire reached into her bag again and removed a folded photograph. It showed the two of us standing together outside the learning center years earlier. I barely remembered the picture being taken. She remembered everything. I almost mailed this to you after we stopped speaking, she admitted. Why did you not? She smiled softly. Because I realized photographs cannot make someone look back if they never had time to truly look in the first place. I carefully held the picture, noticing the way she had been looking toward me while I faced the camera with my attention already somewhere else. It perfectly reflected our entire relationship. Daniel knows about us, I asked quietly after a long silence. Claire nodded. I told him everything. My heart tightened, though I forced myself to remain calm. He sounds like an honest man. He is. She looked directly into my eyes. He also told me something I never expected. I waited patiently. He said that if someone sincerely changes, their past should not become a life sentence. I looked away, uncertain what those words truly meant. Claire gently folded the invitation and placed it back inside her bag. I did not agree to meet you today because I wanted an apology. She paused, her voice remaining warm but steady. I agreed because I wanted to know whether the man sitting beside me came here to win or simply to tell the truth. I answered without hesitation, only to tell the truth. She searched my face for several quiet seconds before giving the smallest nod. Then today has already been worth coming. As we slowly stood from the bench and began walking through the peaceful gardens together, I realized something had changed between us. The past had not disappeared. The mistakes had not been erased. But for the first time in years, neither of us was hiding behind assumptions anymore, and that quiet honesty felt more valuable than any certainty I had ever mistaken for truth. Love proves its deepest strength when it stops asking to be chosen and begins wishing only for another person's happiness. After leaving Riverside Botanical Garden, I did not contact Claire again. Every instinct inside me wanted to call, to explain more, to keep searching for words that might somehow repair the years between us. Instead, I remembered the promise I had silently made beneath the old maple tree. I would not use persistence to replace patience. If my apology had been sincere, then I also had to respect whatever future she chose, even if that future no longer included me. The following week, preparations for Claire's wedding quietly continued throughout the city. Friends spoke excitedly about the ceremony, local charities received additional donations in celebration of the couple, and the Community Learning Center organized a children's book drive to honor the occasion. I contributed anonymously, making certain my name appeared nowhere on the event materials. For the first time in my life, Doing the right thing without expecting recognition no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt peaceful. Victor noticed the difference almost immediately. As we finished reviewing quarterly reports one afternoon, he closed the final folder and looked at me thoughtfully. "You have not asked me for another update about Claire." I smiled. Faintly. "There is nothing left to investigate. You are simply letting her choose." I nodded. "That is something I should have learned years ago." A quiet expression of approval crossed his face before he returned to his work. Even inside Blake Holdings, subtle changes continued reshaping my daily life. Meetings ended earlier because I finally understood that endless hours did not always produce better decisions. Employees who rarely spoke during discussions now found themselves invited into conversations because I had learned the value of listening before leading. Security staff who had quietly protected me for years suddenly heard me asking about their families instead of merely acknowledging their schedules. The company remained successful, but for the first time success no longer seemed measured only by numbers. One Friday afternoon, I returned to the Community Learning Center carrying several new reading tables requested by the teachers. While volunteers arranged books throughout the classrooms, the program director joined me beside the library entrance with a warm smile. "The children have noticed something," she said. "What is that?" I asked. "They say you smile much more now." I laughed softly, surprised by the observation. "Children notice everything." She nodded knowingly, especially when someone begins carrying less weight in their heart. Before leaving, I paused beside the same wall of photographs I had visited weeks earlier. Instead of focusing on the pictures where I had been absent, I quietly admired the countless moments Claire had created for others without asking for praise. I finally understood why she had always seemed so calm. She had built her life around giving instead of proving. As I stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, my phone vibrated gently. A message from an unknown number appeared across the screen. "Thank you for coming to the garden with honesty instead of expectations. Whatever happens next, I hope you continue becoming the man you have chosen to be." I immediately recognized Claire's writing style, even through a brief text message. My fingers rested above the keyboard for several seconds before I answered with the only response that felt worthy of everything we had shared. "Thank you for teaching me that respect is another form of love. I hope your future is filled with every happiness I once failed to protect." I pressed send without expecting another reply. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking toward the waiting car. For the first time since receiving the invitation, my steps felt lighter, not because I had regained what I feared losing, but because I had finally learned that real love is never measured by whether someone chooses you. It is measured by whether you are willing to honor the life they choose, even when it asks you to quietly let them go. The future rarely belongs to the person who waits for another chance. It belongs to the person who becomes worthy of one without expecting it to arrive. 3 weeks passed quietly after my last message to Claire. I buried myself in meaningful work instead of endless work, and every evening I found myself returning to places that reminded me why people mattered more than schedules. The Community Learning Center had become part of my weekly routine. I no longer arrived as a donor or a businessman. I arrived simply as Adrian, someone willing to read stories to children, assemble bookshelves, and spend an hour listening instead of rushing toward another meeting. One bright Saturday morning, the program director walked toward me carrying an envelope with a familiar smile. "Someone asked me to give you this in person." I accepted it carefully, recognizing Claire's handwriting before I even opened it. Inside was a simple handwritten card. "Adrian, thank you for keeping your promise. You did not chase me. You did not ask me to change my decision. Instead, you changed yourself. There is something you deserve to know. The ceremony you believed was my wedding never took place because there was never a wedding to begin with. Daniel and I ended our engagement peacefully after realizing we wanted different futures. Neither of us was wrong. We simply understood that kindness alone is not always enough to build a lifetime together." I folded the letter slowly, uncertain whether I had read the words correctly. The program director smiled gently. "She wanted you to discover that only after she knew your changes were not motivated by hope." I looked up in surprise. "Where is she?" She pointed toward the garden behind the learning center where children had planted flowers every spring for years. I followed the narrow stone path until I saw Claire standing beside a row of blooming lavender. Exactly as peaceful as the first day I had seen her helping that little girl in the botanical garden. She turned as my footsteps approached, and this time neither of us hesitated. We smiled with the quiet familiarity of two people who had finally stopped pretending they understood everything. I almost called you many times, I admitted. Claire laughed softly. I know. How? Because I almost called you too. We both laughed, and the distance that had once seemed impossible suddenly felt much smaller. I looked at her carefully before speaking again. If we begin another chapter, I do not want it to resemble the last one. She nodded. Neither do I. I took a slow breath. I cannot promise life will become simple. I do not need simple, she answered warmly. I need honest. I smiled. That I can promise. She reached for my hand, not because the past had disappeared, but because we had finally learned how to carry it without allowing it to decide our future. Around us, children laughed while turning pages of new books beneath the afternoon sun. The same place that had once reminded me of everything I had neglected had quietly become the place where I learned how to begin again. Looking back now, I understand that the invitation I burned never destroyed my future. My pride almost did. The fire lasted only a few seconds, but the lessons it revealed transformed every day that followed. Love was never asking me to be perfect. It was asking me to be present. Respect was never weakness. It was the strongest form of devotion. And sometimes the greatest redemption does not begin when someone forgives you. It begins the moment you become the person they once believed you could be, even if no one is watching. Because in the end, the rarest victory is not winning someone's heart. It is earning the right to protect it with humility, honesty, and the quiet courage to choose love over pride every single day.